Welcome back. I've been sitting with this particular script for the better part of 2 days, and the detail I keep returning to is how early Mira makes her real decision. She doesn't fight, she doesn't file a complaint, she hands her research to the woman who will destroy herself with it, and then she waits. That single moment of deliberate restraint is where every consequence that follows is born. You're watching historical manhwa. The registration desk smelled like fresh lanyards and conference-grade coffee. That particular burnt, thin smell that never quite becomes real coffee, no matter how expensive the venue. I stood in the queue for my badge and watched Delphine across the lobby. She was laughing with someone from the Thornfield press office, her hand on his arm, her head tilted at the exact angle she used when she needed someone to feel chosen. I had watched that tilt for 4 years. In my first life, I had thought it was charm. In this one, I knew it was inventory. She was cataloging him, deciding if he was useful. The lanyard they handed me was red, presenting author. I looked at it for a moment, then put it around my neck and picked up my conference bag. It had the Asheville International Symposium logo on it. Inside was a printed program, a USB drive with the schedule, and a small bottle of hand sanitizer. I had attended this symposium before. I had not attended it like this. In my first life, I had died at 31, not dramatically. There was no accident, no sudden illness with a meaningful final scene. My heart gave out on a Tuesday evening in March, alone in the university hospital where I had been working for 6 years. The doctors said it was stress-induced arrhythmia. My mother said it was the job. My research partner, former research partner, said nothing because by then she had stopped taking my calls. I had spent the last 4 months of my first life in a state I can only describe as controlled dissolution. I still went to work, I still ate. I answered emails. Oh, but something had broken in me the day I walked into the Thornfield Institute's annual research showcase and saw my name missing from the program. Not from the panel, not from one section, from everything. The research I had spent 3 years developing, a novel longitudinal analysis framework for rare autoimmune biomarkers designed to track treatment response across patient subgroups that existing models couldn't handle, had been presented under someone else's name, Delphine Ashby. She had given the talk beautifully. I had stood at the back of the room and watched it, my hands very still at my sides, my face doing something that must have looked like composure. The audience had applauded. The department head, Dr. Gideon Farley, had called it a landmark contribution to the field. The institute director had shaken Delphine's hand. Oh, no one looked for me. Delphine and I had been co-researchers for 18 months. She had access to my files, my notes, my methodology documentation, my draft manuscripts. We shared a lab server. I had trusted her with the kind of granular, unglamorous detail that forms the architecture of real science. The decision logs, the data cleaning protocols, the annotated code, the failed model runs. In my first life, I had believed she was my collaborator. In the months after the showcase, I found out exactly what she had done. She had spent the final 8 weeks of our collaboration quietly extracting my materials from the shared server. She had created a parallel document structure under her personal account. She had replaced my name on all the primary authorship fields and submitted the work to 3 journals, 2 conferences, and in 1 major funding body, all under her name alone, with a thank you acknowledgement to me that read like a footnote. When I confronted her, she told me the work had evolved significantly from my original concept. She told me that collaboration meant shared contribution, and that her contribution in the final phase had been decisive. She told me, very calmly, that she had the documentation to support her position. She did. Because she had created it. Backdated meeting notes, revised version histories, a selectively edited email chain. I didn't die because Delphine Ashby stole my research. I died because I let her. I had spent 18 months trusting someone I had chosen to trust, and when the structure I built on that trust collapsed, I had nothing left to stand on. I filed internal complaints that went nowhere. So I contacted journals that required formal documentation I couldn't produce fast enough. I built a case while she built a career, and I was slower, because I was doing it honestly. The arrhythmia was just the last thing that happened. I was 31 when I died, and I was 26 when I woke up again. The morning of my rebirth, I was lying in the narrow bed of my graduate student dormitory at Thornfield. And the first thing I was aware of was the smell of the detergent I used to use on my pillowcase. That sharp synthetic citrus that I had switched away from in my third year because it gave me headaches. I was 26. I had 4 years ahead of me. I lay very still for a long time. Then I thought, I am not going to do what I did before. That was the whole decision. It sounds small. It contained everything. But when I had been 26 the first time, I had joined Delphine's collaboration in good faith because she was 2 years my senior, had stronger institutional connections, and had a quality I had confused with warmth. What she actually had was attentiveness. She was very good at knowing what you needed to hear and producing it without it costing her anything. I had wanted a collaborator who believed in the research as much as I did. Delphine believed in what the research could do for her. The second time I was 26, I knew that. I knew it before we had exchanged a single word in this new version of our shared timeline, so I did not join her collaboration. I did something else. At 26, the second time, I had 3 things I hadn't had before. Certainty about what was coming, odds patience that the first version of me had never developed, and a precise memory of every weakness in Delphine's understanding of my work. The weakness was not small. It was structural. Delphine had a strong, general grasp of immunological research. She was fluent in the language of our field, quick with citations, good in meetings. She could read a methodology section and understand its logic. But she had never learned to construct the kind of statistical model I built, the longitudinal mixed effects framework I developed for tracking biomarker trajectories across heterogeneous patient cohorts. She could describe it. She could not derive it. She could not defend the parameter choices. She could not explain the rationale for the 3-phase data cleaning protocol or justify the exclusion criteria for the pediatric subgroup. Almost in my first life, those gaps hadn't mattered. She hadn't needed to defend the work. She had presented it to an audience that was impressed rather than interrogative. In this life, I was going to put her in front of an audience that was neither. The plan took 2 years to build, and it was not a dramatic plan. It was an administrative one. I spent the first 6 months of my second 26th year doing 3 things simultaneously: continuing my research under my own name and documentation, cultivating my relationship with Dr. Gideon Farley, and beginning the very slow, very deliberate process of appearing to trust Delphine again. Gideon was the key to the institutional layer. He was the kind of department head who cared genuinely about the integrity of the field, old enough to have watched academic fraud happen in slower, more obvious forms, not yet wise enough to see it operating at the granular level where Delphine worked. I had watched him fail me in my first life, not out of complicity, but out of inattention. The showcase had happened too fast, the complaint process too slow, and by the time he had looked carefully, the record had already been rewritten. This time I brought him in earlier, not to confide in, not to recruit as an ally. I brought him in as a witness. I began having regular check-ins with Gideon 6 months into my second 26th year, ostensibly to discuss the progress of my research. I used these meetings to do something very specific. I explained my methodology to him in plain language, regularly, with dated meeting notes that I submitted to the departmental record system. Each note included the current state of the model, all the most recent methodological decisions, and my rationale. This was not teaching him immunology. This was creating a trail. By the end of my 27th year, Gideon could not reproduce my model, but he understood its architecture well enough to know when someone was improvising answers about it. I also spent those 2 years building a relationship with Caspian Vane. Caspian was not the reason I survived. I want to be precise about that, but he was a piece of the design, and I would be dishonest if I left him out. He was a senior researcher at the Westmere Biomedical Center. Independent institution, no formal affiliation with Thornfield. He had done foundational work on mixed effects modeling in clinical trial data, which meant he understood the statistical infrastructure of my research better than almost anyone in our field. Well, I had known of him in my first life, but never spoken to him. He had been at the first showcase, the one where Delphine had presented my work, and I had watched him ask 2 questions during the Q&A. Both questions had been answered smoothly by Delphine, because they had been broad questions, the kind that could be answered with conceptual fluency. I had thought, standing at the back of that room, if he had asked the real questions, none of this would have held. In my second life, I introduced myself to him at a mid-level workshop 18 months before the Asheville Symposium. I was careful. I did not try to impress him immediately. I asked him a genuine question about a technical problem I was working through, the handling of informative dropout in longitudinal models. And when he answered it, as that I engaged with the answer at the level where it actually lived, not the level where most people engaged, he noticed. Over the following months, we exchanged emails, then papers in draft form, then eventually a conversation at another workshop that lasted 3 hours longer than either of us had planned. By the time the Asheville Symposium Committee formed its program board, Caspian Vane was on the expert panel. I had not arranged that, but I had arranged for him to know my work. Now, let me explain what I did with Delphine. I am not proud of this part in any simple way, and I am also not ashamed of it. What I did was deliberate, and it required me to behave for 2 years in a way that I found quietly nauseating. I let her back in. Not all the way, not with the same access I had given her in the first life, but enough that she could see the research developing, could understand its shape and direction, could feel, as she had in the first life, that she was close to something important. Delphine had a particular hunger for proximity to work she hadn't done. It wasn't laziness, exactly. She worked hard at the surface operations of academia. She attended every conference, published prolifically in mid-tier journals, cultivated relationships with department heads and funding bodies. But the original, difficult, generative work, the kind that required sitting alone with a problem until the problem gave way, that she couldn't do. And she knew it. What she could do was recognize it when she saw it in someone else. In the first life, she had seen it in me and taken it. In this life, she saw it in me and began again to position herself. I let her. Every 2 or 3 months, I shared a partial update of my research with her. Not enough to reconstruct the model, not the decision logs or the annotated code, but enough that she could follow the general shape of what was being built. I watched her file these updates carefully. I watched her start describing the research at department events in ways that implied familiarity. I watched her, in the spring of my 28th year, submit an abstract to the Asheville Symposium Committee that described, in general but recognizable terms, a longitudinal analysis framework for autoimmune biomarker data. The abstract was accepted. She was scheduled to present in the primary research track on the second day of the symposium. The symposium was 4 months away. I submitted my own abstract to the symposium committee, a different track, as the workshop strand, and it was accepted. Then I submitted the full manuscript of my research to the Asheville Journal of Biomedical Science, which was the primary publication sponsor of the symposium. I had been sitting on the finished manuscript for 8 months. I had timed the submission carefully. The review process took 6 weeks. The paper was accepted with minor revisions. I completed the revisions in a weekend. The paper was officially published with a public timestamp and a DOI 3 weeks before the symposium opened. I did not tell Delphine. Let me talk about the documentation. In my first life, the thing that had undone me was the asymmetry between how carefully I had documented my research and how carelessly I had documented my ownership of it. I had meticulous notes about the science, showing that I had almost nothing that would hold up as evidence of priority. Nothing with clear timestamps. Nothing stored in a way that couldn't be contested. Delphine had been able to rewrite the record because the record was soft. In this second life, I made the record hard. Every decision I made during the development of the research was logged in a system I built specifically for this purpose. Not a shared system, a personal repository hosted on an external server I controlled with automatic timestamping. Every version of every document, every annotated code commit, every draft, every discarded model run went into this repository with a date and time that could not be retroactively altered. I also, and this took the most patience, kept a record of every interaction with Delphine, every email, every meeting note, and every partial update I shared with her, with a note of what was shared and what was not. Every instance of her repeating my language in departmental settings, with a timestamp. This record was not a complaint. It was not formatted as an accusation. It was a log, precise, dry, and thorough. By the time the symposium arrived, the log ran to 240 pages. The symposium opened on a Wednesday in October. Asheville Conference Center was north of the city. A large glass and concrete structure that had been designed, I suspected, by an architect who had wanted to suggest openness without actually providing it. The atrium was high and full of light, but the corridors were narrow, and the main auditorium had the particular acoustics of a space built for presentations rather than conversation. And I arrived on the first day in time for the morning plenary. The opening talk was given by a researcher from Edinburgh who had done strong work on complement system activation. It was a good talk, clear, methodologically sound, with a Q&A that ran long because the questions were good. I sat in the third row and took notes on paper, which I still preferred to a laptop. Delphine arrived during the coffee break. She came in with 2 people from the Thornfield Communications team, which told me everything about the approach she planned to take. She had not come to the symposium as a researcher. She had come as a public face. She wore a dark green blazer, and her hair was arranged in a way that had clearly taken time. She looked, as she always looked at events like this, like someone who was exactly where they belonged. As I watched her scan the room, I was standing near the coffee station with my conference bag over one shoulder and a cup of the thin, burnt coffee in my hand. When her eyes passed over me, there was a small pause, a half-second recalibration. And then she smiled and came toward me. "Mira, I didn't know you were presenting here." "Workshop Strand," I said. "Thursday afternoon?" She nodded the way she nodded when she was processing information she hadn't expected. The smile didn't change. "The Workshop Strand. Good for you." A brief, warm look. "Are you staying for the whole symposium?" "Yes," I said. "Then we'll have time to catch up." She touched my arm once, lightly, and moved on towards someone more immediately useful. I watched her go. She did not know the paper was published. The afternoon of the first day, I attended a session on novel cytokine pathway mapping that had nothing to do with my research and was genuinely interesting. I took notes. I asked one question during the Q&A, a technical question about the handling of confounding variables in the cohort design. The presenter gave a good answer. I thanked her. That evening, there was a symposium dinner at a restaurant attached to the conference center. I sat at a table with 3 researchers I had met at previous workshops, a computational biologist from Amsterdam, a clinical immunologist from Cape Town, and a young postdoc from Toronto who had recently published a paper that I had read and found quietly remarkable. We talked about the Edinburgh talk, about the direction of the field, about the funding climate. The food was good. Just the wine was served in glasses that were too large for the pour, which made everyone hold them awkwardly. Across the room, I could see Delphine at a table with Gideon and 2 people I recognized as members of the symposium program committee. She was performing for them. Not obviously, but I could see the architecture of it. The careful questions, the listening that looked like the most important listening anyone had ever done. She was constructing, in real time, the version of herself that would present tomorrow. I ate my dinner and talked about science and did not look at her again. I did not sleep well that night. This surprised me. I had believed during the 2 years of preparation that by the time I reached the symposium, I would feel something close to calm. Not certainty. I had never been certain that the plan would hold, but the particular steadiness that comes from knowing you have done everything available to you. Instead, I lay in the hotel room and listened to the ventilation system and thought about the first life. Not with grief, with something more like precision. I ran through it the way I sometimes ran through my methodology, checking for gaps, looking for the place where I had gone wrong. The place I kept returning to was not the day of the showcase. It was earlier than that. It was the day, 18 months into the first collaboration, when Delphine had asked me to move my project files to the shared server so we could work more fluidly. I had done it without a second thought because I had trusted her. And because moving to a shared server had seemed like the obvious collaborative thing to do. That was the moment. Not the theft. The theft came later. That was the moment I had made myself vulnerable. In this life, my files had never been on a shared server. I turned off the bedside light at 11:30 and was asleep by midnight. The second day of the symposium. The primary research track ran in the main auditorium, a tiered space that held about 300 people with a large projection screen and a podium lit from the front so that the presenter was very visible, very exposed. Delphine was scheduled to present at 11 o'clock. Her talk was titled, "A Longitudinal Framework for Biomarker Trajectory Analysis in Heterogeneous Autoimmune Cohorts." but I read the title in the printed program over breakfast and did not feel anything particularly strong. Just a recognition, clean and particular, the way you recognize a word in a foreign language you have studied until it stops sounding foreign. The session chair introduced the morning block at 10:05. There were 3 presenters before Delphine. I sat in the 4th row on the aisle and listened to all 3. One was genuinely excellent, a young researcher from Lyon who had developed a novel method for tissue-specific cytokine measurement. I made a note to find her paper. At 11:05, Delphine walked to the podium. She looked steady. She always looked steady. She thanked the session chair, thanked the symposium committee, acknowledged the support of the Thornfield Institute. Then she pulled up her first slide and began. Oh, the talk was good. I want to be honest about that. She had spent time on it. The slides were clean, the narrative arc was clear, the language was precise without being opaque. She had done what she always did well. She had taken the shape of something and polished it until it looked finished. What she had not done was understand the interior. I watched the audience, 300 researchers in a tiered auditorium, most of them with notebooks or laptops, a few leaning forward in the way that people do when they are genuinely engaged. Caspian was in the 2nd row, on the right side of the room. I had spotted him when I came in. He was watching the slides with the particular focused stillness of someone who works with numbers and knows when they do not quite add up. Delphine moved through the methodology section with confidence. She described the 3-phase data cleaning protocol. She described the mixed effects model structure. She described the patient stratification approach and the rationale for the primary outcome measure. I counted the words she had borrowed directly from my documentation. There were quite a few. The session chair opened the Q&A at 11:52. Hands went up. The chair, a methodologist from Zurich whose work I respected, pointed to the first questioner, a woman in the front row. The first question was broad. What were the implications of the framework for clinical decision-making in practice? Delphine answered it well. It was the kind of question she had prepared for. The second question, from a man 3 rows back, was about the generalizability of the cohort design. Delphine answered it with appropriate caveats. Still safe territory. The third question was Caspian's. He raised his hand with the slight deliberateness of someone who has been holding a question for 20 minutes and has decided it will not wait any longer. The session chair nodded at him. He stood. He was tall enough that standing wasn't necessary to be seen, but he stood anyway, and I thought it was probably habit. Thank you for the presentation. I have a technical question about the model specification. He had a quiet, precise way of speaking. No preamble, no warmth, just the question arriving like a correctly addressed letter. The mixed effects structure you described uses a 3-level hierarchy. Can you walk us through the reasoning behind the covariance structure you chose for the random effects? Oh, and specifically, why you specified an unstructured rather than compound symmetry form? A silence. Not a long silence. Maybe 2 seconds? But 2 seconds, in a room of 300 researchers, after a technical question from a statistician with 20 years of published work in this exact area, is a very particular kind of silence. Delphine smiled. That's an excellent question, she said. She looked at her slides. She clicked back 1 slide, then forward again. The smile held. The covariance structure was chosen to best accommodate the heterogeneity within the patient cohorts. The unstructured form allows for greater flexibility in modeling individual-level variation. Caspian nodded slowly. Yes, that's the general rationale for unstructured covariance. What my question was specifically about the choice at this stage of the analysis. The 3-level specification creates a substantial increase in estimated parameters. What informed the decision that the model complexity was justified by the data structure, and how did you evaluate the fit? Another silence. This one lasted longer. I watched Delphine's face do something I had never seen it do before, which was lose its coordination. It didn't collapse. It wasn't dramatic. A trained eye would have seen it as a small hesitation, a slight search. But I had watched that face for 4 years in my first life, and for 2 years in this one. And I knew exactly what I was seeing. She did not know the answer. She did not know it because she had never had to make the decision the answer referred to. I had made it, And on a Tuesday afternoon in late autumn in my second 27th year, sitting at my desk with 3 different model specifications open side by side, working through the fit statistics for 2.5 hours until I was certain. I had written a 12-page decision log about that choice alone. Delphine had never seen that log. The fit was evaluated through comparative model assessment, she said. Standard criteria. Caspian waited. He was the kind of person who waited very comfortably. Which criteria specifically? He asked. AIC, BIC, likelihood ratio testing? A combination of criteria, she said. The analysis was comprehensive. Caspian sat down. He sat down slowly, the way people do when they have received an answer they fully expected to receive. Almost the 4th question came from the session chair herself, the methodologist from Zurich. I want to follow up on the exclusion criteria for the pediatric subgroup. The abstract mentions that a subset of younger patients was excluded from the primary analysis. Can you explain the clinical rationale for that exclusion and whether sensitivity analyses were conducted with the full cohort? Delphine looked at her slides again. The pediatric exclusion was not arbitrary. I had spent 6 weeks corresponding with the clinical team that had contributed the pediatric data. Oh, and the decision to exclude the subgroup from the primary analysis, while retaining them in the secondary sensitivity analysis, had come out of a detailed discussion about age-specific cytokine maturation patterns that made direct comparison with the adult cohort methodologically inappropriate. The decision was documented. The documentation was thorough. The sensitivity analysis existed and showed what it needed to show. Delphine did not know about the correspondence with the clinical team. She did not know about the cytokine maturation literature that underpinned the exclusion rationale. She had a slide that mentioned the exclusion in 2 sentences. The exclusion criteria were determined based on clinical factors affecting data comparability, she said. Well, the pediatric subgroup presented a different profile that could affect the robustness of the primary findings. Were sensitivity analyses conducted? The chair repeated. The analysis plan included consideration of sensitivity approaches, Delphine said. The full write-up of the supplementary material addresses this in more detail. The chair nodded, in the measured way of someone making a note. There was a supplementary material file. I had written it. It was attached to the published manuscript, which was sitting in the Asheville Journal of Biomedical Sciences online archive with my name on it. The 5th question was from a researcher in the back row who asked about the software environment used for the analysis. The answer was my answer, a combination of R packages I had built and modified, some of which I had written from scratch. Hess Delphine named R and 2 standard packages. She did not mention the custom code. She could not because she did not know it existed. The 6th question came from a young postdoc near the front who asked about plans for the framework's public release. Delphine said they were considering the best pathway for sharing tools with the community. She glanced once toward her slides in a way that suggested she was hoping this would be the last question. The session chair called time. Delphine stepped back from the podium and the applause was polite. Not the enthusiastic kind, but the kind that fills the space a talk leaves behind and nothing more. I did not applaud. I was looking at Caspian. He was writing something in a small notebook he kept in his jacket pocket. He finished writing it, clicked his pen closed, and looked up. Across the room, we made eye contact for approximately 1 second. I looked back down at my own notebook. The coffee break after the session was held in the atrium. I stood at the edge of it with a glass of water and let the room arrange itself. Researchers form clusters at conference breaks the way water finds the lowest available space, quickly, efficiently, along existing channels. I could see who was talking to whom, and I could see that 2 clusters in particular had formed around people who had been in that auditorium. One cluster was around Delphine. She was still performing, still producing the attentive, confident face, but there were fewer people around her than I would have expected after a talk of that type, and the people who were there were talking to her rather than asking her questions. That was a subtle but meaningful distinction. Oh, the other cluster was around Caspian. He was not at the center of it. He was to the side, a coffee cup in hand, speaking with the methodologist from Zurich and the computational biologist from Amsterdam. They were speaking with the focused intensity of people who have noticed the same thing at the same time. Gideon found me. He came across the atrium with his own coffee, his expression carrying something careful. "I watched the Q&A," he said. "I know," I said. I had seen him in the audience. He was quiet for a moment. He was a careful man. He had spent his career in an institution where being careful was a form of survival, and it had become his default register. "The questions from Dr. Vane and from the chair," he said. "Yes?" Delphine did not. The answers were not technically specific. I looked at him. No. But they weren't. He looked at his coffee. Then, "Mira, is there something I should be looking at?" "Yes," I said. "I'd like to show it to you this afternoon if you have time." He nodded. He looked slightly relieved to have a structure to move toward. We agreed to meet at 2 o'clock in one of the small meeting rooms the conference center made available to speakers. At 12:15, I went to the symposium administrative desk and asked to speak with the program director. The program director was a brisk, efficient woman named Patricia who managed the conference logistics with the visible competence of someone who had done this enough times to understand exactly which problems were solvable and which ones she would need to manage around. She had short gray hair and a badge that said Program Director in capital letters. So I gave her my name and told her I was the author of a paper published 3 weeks ago in the Asheville Journal of Biomedical Science. I had a printed copy with me. The full manuscript, with the journal header and publication date visible on the first page, and my name in the author field. I told her I believed the research presented in the morning's primary track session contained work that originated from this publication. I was not emotional about this. I used administrative language. I was clear, I was precise, and I did not editorialize. Patricia looked at the manuscript. She looked at the publication date. She asked me 2 questions. I answered them. She said she would need to consult with the journal editor and the program committee before any formal process could begin, but that she would document the concern and escalate it appropriately. I thanked her and returned to the atrium. At 2 o'clock, I met Gideon in the small meeting room, which smelled like the carpet cleaner they had used on it recently and had a narrow window that looked out onto the conference center's service road. I had brought a laptop and a printed set of documents. I did not give him everything. I gave him what he needed to understand what had happened in the correct order with the correct context. I showed him the published manuscript first, the journal, the date, the author field. Then I showed him the version history of the research, the dated repository records, which went back to the beginning of the project in chronological sequence. Each entry had a timestamp that was independently verifiable. I showed him 3 key technical decisions: the covariance structure, the pediatric exclusion rationale, and the custom code, documented in my logs from the dates they had been made, more than a year before the Asheville Symposium abstract submission deadline. Then I showed him the log I had kept of my interactions with Delphine. Not all 240 pages. 40 pages, carefully selected. The emails that showed what I had shared with her and when, the meeting notes from our partial update conversations, and 3 instances of her using my language at departmental events with the relevant dates. Gideon read everything slowly. He was the kind of person who read slowly because he was reading carefully, not because he was slow. When he was done, he sat for a moment with his hands flat on the table. "Oh, how long have you been keeping this record?" he said. 2 years, I said. He looked up. Something in his face shifted. Not surprise exactly, more like a reordering of a picture he had been looking at from the wrong angle. "You anticipated this?" he said. I didn't answer the question the way he'd asked it. I said, I knew my work was valuable, and I knew it was accessible to someone who might not treat it carefully, so I was careful. He nodded. He looked back at the documents. "What do you want to happen?" he said. It was a direct question, and I respected him for asking it directly. "I want the record to be corrected," I said. "The symposium program should know the source of the research presented this morning. The journal should know the publication timeline. And Thornfield should have this documentation in its formal records." I slid the last sheet toward him. "I've written a formal research integrity complaint. It documents everything we just discussed. I'd like your signature as a witness, and I'd like it filed through the Institute's formal process before the symposium ends." Gideon looked at the complaint. He read the first page. He looked up at me. "This is thorough," he said. "Yes," I said. He signed it. I want to describe the afternoon, not because anything dramatic happened in it. The symposium ran its normal course: more presentations, another coffee break, a workshop in the East Wing on funding application strategy that I had thought about attending but decided against. I gave my own presentation at 3:30 in the workshop strand, a 40-minute talk on the framework. It delivered to an audience of about 60 researchers, with slides I had spent 4 weeks on and a Q&A that ran long because the questions were good. I answered every question. I knew the rationale behind every decision. When a researcher from Seoul asked about the covariance structure, I walked him through the model comparison in detail. The 3 specifications, the fit statistics, the decision tree I had worked through on that Tuesday afternoon in my 27th year. He nodded as I spoke. "That's very thorough documentation," he said. "I keep detailed records," I said. After the workshop ended, several people stayed to talk. The computational biologist from Amsterdam, who had been in Delphine's morning session as well as mine, caught my eye as the room was clearing and said, with a particular careful precision, "These 2 presentations today, there is some overlap in the conceptual territory." "Yes," I said, "that will be addressed through formal channels." He nodded once and said nothing else. At 5 o'clock, I received an email from Patricia in the program office. It informed me that the symposium's research integrity protocol had been initiated, that the program committee was in contact with the Asheville Journal of Biomedical Science editorial board, and that both parties had been notified. The email used formal administrative language throughout. It told me I would be contacted for further information as required. The last line told me that a formal note had been placed in the symposium record attached to the morning session. I read it twice, then closed the email. I did not seek out Delphine that evening. She found me. It was after the symposium dinner, which I had attended but left early. I was walking through the glass corridor that connected the conference center to the hotel block, and she was coming the other way. She had been told. I could see it immediately. The controlled face had developed a particular tension at the jaw. Very slight, the kind that people produce when they have absorbed something damaging and are deciding how to carry it. She stopped walking when she saw me. I stopped too. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The corridor was quiet. Everyone else was still at dinner or at the bar that had set up in the conference atrium. "You published it," she said. 3 weeks ago," I said. She looked at me for a long moment. Something moved across her face that I watched with considerable attention. It was not guilt, exactly. It was something more like the recalculation that happens when a plan encounters a fact it had not included. "You could have told me," she said. "I did tell you," I said. "I told you 2 years ago in the department seminar that I was developing this framework as my primary research output. You were in the room." She was quiet. "You shared the work with me," she said. "We discussed it." "I shared partial updates with you," I said. "I documented every one of them. The documentation shows exactly what was shared and what was not." She stared at me. The jaw tension had spread, very slightly, to the space around her eyes. "Gideon," she started. "Gideon has seen the documentation," I said. He signed the formal complaint this afternoon." A pause. "Mira, I'm going to bed," I said. "Good night." I walked past her. She did not say anything else. The corridor smelled like carpet cleaner, and distantly, from the direction of the hotel lobby, I could hear the sound of the elevator arriving at the ground floor. The 3rd day of the symposium. I had slept adequately, woken at 6, lain still for a while listening to the ventilation, and then gotten up and showered and gone down for breakfast before the main dining room filled up. The morning felt different from the previous 2 days. Not charged, exactly. More like a room where something has recently been moved and the air still remembers where it was. I ate eggs and toast and read my email. There were 3 new ones related to the integrity process. One from the Asheville Journal confirming they had received the program committee's inquiry and were reviewing the submission timeline records. One from the Thornfield Institute's research integrity officer confirming receipt of the formal complaint. And one from a researcher I didn't know who had been at my afternoon workshop and wanted to ask a follow-up question about the model specification. I answered the research question first. Then I read the other 2 emails again, carefully, and filed them. By the time the morning session began, there was a quality to the way people moved through the atrium that I recognized from other academic settings where something unspoken had changed the atmosphere of a room. Clusters formed differently. Conversations paused when certain people walked past. The program committee members were not visible at the coffee station where they had been the previous 2 mornings. Delphine was not in the main auditorium for the morning session. I was. Caspian was 3 rows ahead of me. At the morning coffee break, he walked toward me with the particular directness of someone who has been deciding whether to have a conversation and has decided yes. "I reviewed your paper last night," he said. "Which paper?" I said, though I knew. "The one published in the Asheville Journal 3 weeks ago." He had a slight accent I had never precisely identified, something Northern European, worn smooth by decades of international conferences. "The covariance structure decision." "You documented the comparison across 3 specifications." "Yes." "You chose unstructured based on likelihood ratio testing and a Bayesian information criterion comparison with a robustness check using a restricted maximum likelihood estimator." "Yes." He looked at me steadily. "That's the correct decision. It's also a decision that requires understanding why it's correct, not just that it is." I looked back at him. "I know," I said. He nodded once. "The question I asked in the Q&A yesterday." "I know," I said again. A short pause. He turned his coffee cup in his hands, which was, I had noticed, a habit of his when he was thinking. "The complaint that's been filed," he said. Not a question. Yes. I've been asked to provide a written expert assessment of the technical content of both presentations for the program committee." He looked at me with the precise, undisguised directness that characterized everything he did. "That assessment will note that the technical detail present in your workshop presentation and in the published manuscript is consistent with the depth of original authorship, and that the technical detail present in the morning presentation is not." I held his gaze. "Thank you," I said. "I'm not doing it for you specifically," he said. "I'm doing it because methodology is my area and the record should be accurate." "I know that too," I said. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, more like a recognition. "You seem very unsurprised by all of this," he said. "I'm not unsurprised," I said. "I'm prepared." He thought about that. Then he said, "Your paper is very good." He walked back toward the auditorium, coffee in hand. The formal process moved through its stages over the following weeks with the careful procedural pace of institutions that have been designed to be thorough and are, consequently, slow. I returned to Thornfield on the Friday after the symposium ended. The research integrity investigation took 4 months. I will not narrate all of it because most of it was administrative. Document submission, formal interviews, written responses, the grinding institutional machinery of a process designed to be fair to everyone, which meant it was slow for everyone. What I will tell you is what the investigation found. The program committee determined that the methodology and core findings presented in Delphine's symposium talk were substantially derived from my published manuscript and my underpinning research documentation. The timeline established by my repository records and the journal's submission logs showed that the research had been developed over 3 years under my primary authorship, during which time Delphine had received partial information updates that were clearly insufficient to have generated the work independently. Caspian's expert assessment confirmed that the technical content of my workshop presentation and the published manuscript were consistent with original authorship, meaning that the level of methodological knowledge I demonstrated could only have come from someone who had made the decisions themselves. His assessment also noted, precisely, and without editorializing, that the answers given during the morning Q&A session were not consistent with that level of knowledge. The Asheville Journal of Biomedical Science issued a statement confirming the priority of my publication and noting that no submission from Delphine or the Thornfield Institute had been received in relation to the relevant research framework. The Thornfield Institute's Research Integrity Committee concluded, 4 months after the symposium, that Delphine had misrepresented the origin of the research she had presented. They recommended formal sanctions. The specific terms were confidential, but I was told they included a formal record notation, a required disclosure attached to future publications produced during her time at Thornfield, and a mandated review of all other work produced during the period in question. She resigned from the institute 6 weeks later. The resignation announcement, circulated internally, cited personal reasons and a desire to pursue other opportunities. I want to be careful about how I describe what came after, because this is not a story about what I gained. It's a story about what I built and what happened when I stopped letting it be taken from me. In the months following the investigation, my paper became one of the more cited publications in its subfield for that year. The framework I had developed began to be used by clinical research teams in 3 other countries. I received correspondence from researchers in Germany, Australia, and Canada who were applying the model to their own longitudinal cohorts. Though I was invited to present at 4 international conferences in the following year. At 2 of them, I was on the expert panel. At 1, I gave the opening plenary. Gideon, at the end of the academic year, recommended me for a senior research fellowship, a position I had watched him recommend Delphine for in my first life 7 months after the showcase. I accepted it. The fellowship came with a dedicated research budget, a larger lab space, and 2 postdoctoral positions to fill. I filled them with care. I chose people who asked the right kinds of questions, and I kept meticulous records of everything, because I was not going to stop doing that. Not ever. About Caspian. I had not planned for what happened with Caspian beyond what I needed from him as a piece of the institutional design: his expertise, his presence on the panel, his capacity to ask the question that would illuminate the gap. What I had not planned for was the follow-up email he sent me, 6 days after the symposium ended. It was about a technical detail in the paper, a question about whether I had considered an alternative approach to the missing data imputation in the secondary analysis. It was a good question. I thought about it for 2 days before I answered it. We had an exchange that lasted 3 weeks and covered 8 pages of emails. At the end of it, he asked if I was planning to attend a workshop in January that the Westmere Biomedical Center was hosting on longitudinal methods in clinical research. I said I was planning to attend, which was only true in the sense that I began planning it the moment I read his email. The workshop was good. The papers presented were strong. Folks, on the second afternoon, during a break between sessions, we had a conversation about the future directions of longitudinal biomarker analysis that lasted until the session chair came to find us because the afternoon block had begun. I will not narrate what came after that because it is not the story's concern. What I will say is that he was, as I had understood from the beginning, someone who moved toward the genuine thing and away from the performed version. When he finally understood the full shape of what had happened, not from me, but from the investigation documents that were, in parts, a matter of institutional record, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You didn't tell me at the time. You let me figure it out from what I saw." "Yes," I said. "You didn't want my sympathy." "I wanted your accurate assessment," I said. "Oh, sympathy would have complicated it." He thought about that. Then, "It was an accurate assessment." "Yes," I said. "It was." Let me tell you about the moment I think about most. From those 3 days at the Asheville International Symposium, it is not the Q&A. It is not the conversation with Gideon, or the walk through the glass corridor, or the email from Patricia at 5 o'clock. It is something that happened during my own workshop presentation, which I have not described in full. 40 minutes into the talk, I was walking through the rationale for the pediatric subgroup exclusion, explaining the cytokine maturation literature, the correspondence with the clinical team, the design of the sensitivity analysis. I had a slide with a simplified version of the decision tree, and I was working through it in real time, explaining each branch. And then a hand went up in the middle of the room. It was a researcher I didn't recognize, a woman in her early 30s, sitting near the center of the audience with a notebook open on her knee. She was leaning forward slightly, which was the posture of someone who had been tracking the presentation closely. "Can I ask," she said, "how you handled the communication of these exclusion decisions to clinical teams who contributed data? There's often a disconnect between what makes statistical sense and what clinicians feel is appropriate for their patients." I looked at her. It was a good question. It was the kind of question that comes from someone who has encountered the problem in practice, not in theory, not from reading about methodology, but from sitting in rooms with clinicians and working through the friction. I answered it. And then I talked about the correspondence process I had used, the importance of framing the exclusion in terms of the specific analysis objective rather than the data quality, the way sensitivity analyses serve as a form of accountability to the excluded group. When I finished, she nodded and made a note in her notebook. "That's exactly the approach I wish I'd had documentation for last year," she said. After the session, she stayed behind and introduced herself. She was a postdoctoral researcher from Larchwood University, working on a longitudinal study of a different rare condition, different cohort, different biology, but a parallel methodological challenge. I gave her my contact information. We began corresponding 2 weeks later. That correspondence became, over the following year, a collaboration. Not a genuine one, the kind where both people bring something necessary and neither person needs to extract from the other. The paper we eventually published together, a year and a half later, was built on a shared server. But before we set it up, I spent half an afternoon writing a data governance agreement that covered access levels, version control, authorship, attribution, and documentation standards. She signed it without hesitation. Then she added one clause I hadn't thought of. I signed it too. There is one more thing I want to say about Delphine. It is not a thing about what happened to her. Her resignation, her departure from Thornfield, the formal record notation that would follow her publications, I had known these were the likely consequences and I had pursued them deliberately, and I have no complicated feelings about that. I say what I want to say is about what I learned from the Q&A. The moment I had planned for, the moment Caspian asked his question and the silence arrived, was not the moment I had imagined during 2 years of preparation. I had imagined it would feel like resolution, like the closing of a circuit. It didn't feel like that. It felt like witnessing something clinical and inevitable. The way a doctor might feel watching a test confirm a diagnosis they already knew. The outcome was not a surprise. The mechanism was not elegant. It was just accurate. Delphine had always been able to perform knowledge. What she had never been able to do was survive the questions that came from someone who had the knowledge themselves. What is that gap between the performance of understanding and the understanding itself is not something you can paper over with preparation time or good slides or confident delivery. It lives in the specific, the granular, the decision that was made on a particular afternoon for a particular reason that can only be explained by someone who made it. She hadn't made those decisions. She couldn't explain them. I could. That is not a complicated lesson. It is the simplest one. I keep the repository still. Every decision I make in my research, every methodological choice, every data handling step, every piece of code, every exchange with a collaborator goes into the record. Time-stamped, archived, organized, not because I'm afraid of what might happen if I don't, because the record is the research. And so the decisions and the documentation are the same thing. The science lives in the specificity of the choices, and the choices live in the record of why they were made. In my first life, I kept the science, but not the record. In this one, I keep both. The last thing. Months after the investigation concluded, I was presenting at a conference in the same city where Thornfield is located. Not at the Institute, but at a university venue nearby. A 2-day event, a smaller gathering, more focused on methodology than our usual clinical research crowd. After my talk, during the coffee break, a graduate student approached me. She was young, 24, maybe 25. She had a notebook covered in dense handwriting and the slightly exhausted expression of someone who is doing good work and not yet sure if anyone will notice. Once she said she had read my paper. She said she had been trying to apply the framework to her own longitudinal data set and had hit a problem with the random effects specification. She walked me through the problem. It was a real problem, the kind that takes a particular kind of thinking to work through. I asked her 3 questions. She answered all 3. The answers showed me where the knot was. "Here," I said, and took the pen she offered me and drew a quick diagram in the margin of her notebook. The specification is treating these 2 levels as independent when they're not. You need to allow for this correlation structure, and when you do, the convergence problem resolves. She looked at the diagram. Then she looked up. "That's it," she said. "That's exactly it. How did you—" "I made the same mistake," I said. "And in an earlier version of the model. I have it in my decision log if you want the full walkthrough." She said she did. I sent it to her that afternoon. A month later, she sent me the output from her corrected model with a short email that said only, "It worked." Thank you. I saved it. Not in the repository, just in my inbox where I could find it. The symposium program from the Asheville International Symposium sits in a folder on my desk. I kept it. The printed version, with the lanyard still clipped to the cover from where I attached it on the first morning. The folder also contains a printout of the published paper. First page only, my name in the author field, the journal logo at the top, the publication date in the header, and a single page from the decision log dated the Tuesday of my 27th year, just with a short heading, covariance structure, rationale, and comparison, 12 paragraphs. Very dry, very specific, completely unreadable to anyone who hadn't made the decision themselves. The lanyard is still red. Presenting author. I still have it.